Politics, everyone, our special coverage of the presidential election. In 2016, the polls gave Democrats a false sense of security in the upper Midwest in failing to predict Trump's success there. And coming into this year, we thought pollsters fixed their issues. And while that might be true in some cases, they were still off again this year, even more so than the last election, particularly in predicting Democratic gains in the House that didn't come to pass and Democratic wins in a few key Senate races. Joining us now is David Graham, staff writer at The Atlantic. David, great to have you with us on the show. I know you've written extensively about this, so I do want to start at the presidential level. We know President Trump outperforming his polls in almost all of the battleground states. Do we have a sense yet of what pollsters might have missed this time around?
We don't have a solid sense. And, we should say when we get to final national popular voting, it may be that the distance between what we saw in those national polls and the final margin is not going to be that much. But we see on the state level polls and Senate polls and House polls, on all of these things, we see that it's off by several points, sometimes as much as 5, 6, or 7 points. We don't know how much, what the reasons are yet. We can speculate whether that is, Trump voters who are unwilling to talk or poor weighting. We don't really know. We just know that the results seem to be off by a decent amount.
David, we've seen Nate Silver, of course, of 538 fame, being taken through the ringer, essentially, because he got it, quote unquote, wrong again this year, as he did in the 2016 election. Also, The Economist, for example, even publishing their source code so people could look under the hood at their probability models. Just taking a step back, how do these organizations, these entities actually come up with their models? And why do we think, or give us a sense of why it is so difficult to actually get it right each year?
Yeah, and I guess I should say in their defense, in both cases they forecast a Biden win, and right now that seems like the most likely outcome. So on the sort of black or white question, they seem to have gotten that. What these guys do is, the theory is any individual poll can be wrong, and so what you want to do is you want to average a lot of polls together. You want to look at the whole picture, and then you want to weight those things. You want to get the state polls in there. You want to figure out what you think the electorate will look like. You want to account for potential outside shocks. And you want to do that to build something that will predict with the most data possible who will win. And the amount of work that The Economist or Nate Silver puts into this is really impressive. I mean, the models are extremely complicated and difficult to do. But they're also models, and there are assumptions baked in. And they're also dependent on the source of the polls that they're getting. And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong in the way they predict.
Yeah, very good point there, David. A very difficult job that these people have, but what do you think they did better in this election cycle? What are some of the factors that they perhaps fixed compared to 2016?
So I think the biggest thing is they were looking at weighting for education. We saw in a lot of the polls from 4 years ago, there was a much stronger white non-college educated vote in a lot of places than the pollsters expected. And so you saw the pollsters really making an effort to reach those people. And you saw the analysts like 538 putting a greater emphasis on polls that included that. Nonetheless, there was clearly a much larger turnout for Trump than a lot of people expected. And it seems to probably have been partly among those kinds of voters. So whatever was happening didn't totally grasp who those people are and what their likelihood to vote was.
David, I want to read one specific part of your recent piece on this because I found it very interesting. You wrote, "Parties are now most ideologically homogenous. We no longer spend much time around people who disagree with us. Public opinion polling was one of the last ways we had to understand what other Americans actually believe, especially since social platforms are also increasingly becoming echo chambers. What do you think is going to be the best way for us to get a glimpse into what the other side is thinking and feeling if some of these polls are not as reliable as we had thought?"
I think it's a great question. And as a reporter, I feel a little bit unmoored by the situation. I sort of came up in an era when we trusted the polls. And part of the argument of these places was so much reporting is prone to bias, intentional or not, or just asking the wrong people. Polls give you a better look at who folks are. If the polls don't do that, I don't know how we're supposed to find that. And I think the answer is some combination of we need to fix some things at the polls. And we also need to make sure we're supplementing the polls with lots of reporting outside. I suspect a lot of this comes down to also we need to stop sort of fetishizing the polls so much. And it just needs to be less of a focus on our coverage. And we can talk about other things besides the polls. They're still an important part of the mix. But we shouldn't put as much weight on them, perhaps, as we have been doing in the last two presidential cycles.
Okay, so on that note, David, what do you think would be the most prudent way to cover the next elections? Is it focusing more on candidate policies to allow people to make their own decisions? What would be your advice if you had a magic wand for media outlets next time around?
Yeah, I mean, I think talking about policy questions is really important. I think talking about what's going on in communities that are, we know where changing vote is, and we can focus on those communities. We can focus on the issues. We can focus on the polls, but just de-emphasize them a little bit and put them in a better context. It's really got to be about a sort of complete picture. And I think it's interesting, when Nate Silver founded 538, he was frustrated by bad coverage of polls, but he also hoped that by creating better coverage, he would free reporters up to do more of that kind of nuts and bolts policy reporting that he felt like was missing. And instead, I feel like the way a lot of the press has responded is simply to cover Nate Silver more fully.
All right, David, thank you so much for your insight today. That's David Graham, staff writer at The Atlantic. Thanks again.